Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, something we've never done before, a full edition program, the story of one journalist who was behind bars in Yemen. What makes this case relevant is that it provides us with a glimpse into the coverage of the covert war on terror and the perils reporters face when working on that story. The case also says a lot about the relationship between Yemen and the United States. And it exposes the Obama administration to its critics, human rights groups, press freedom organizations, who say the administration's public support for freedom of the press around the globe is hypocritical given what's happening in Yemen and America's central role in the continued imprisonment of Abdul Shai. Shai is a Yemeni whose reporting on al-qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula was published in Yemen, and who also worked for Al Jazeera, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and ABC News. What set his work apart, beyond his courage, were his contacts within al-qaeda. He was the first to prove that airstrikes on al-qaeda targets in 2009 were not the work of the Yemeni Air Force, but of American drones. His reports disputed the official narrative that scores of militants were killed in those strikes. He published evidence that dozens of women and children were among the casualties. Then he was accused of being a member of al-qaeda and recruiting others into the movement. He ended up behind bars, convicted by a special court that appears designed to intimidate Yemeni journalists. And when Yemen's government was preparing to release Shai, to pardon him, that government got a phone call from Washington urging it to keep him in jail, which it did. That call did not come from an unnamed American official. It did not come from an anonymous State Department operative. It came from Barack Obama himself. In part two, a feature interview on the legal case and the way it's been covered. But first, the story of Abdul Shai.
He was taken from his house and nobody knew where he was for more than 30 days. He basically disappeared.
They just basically don't want the international media to cover stories about al-qaeda.
Well, Abdul Shai did not get a fair trial, and I really say this unequivocally.
The trial has severely undermined investigative journalism in a place like Yemen.
If Abdul Shai ever makes it out of the prison where he has spent the last year and a half, his friends may have difficulty recognizing him.
The last time I saw him was in October 2010 during his trial, and he'd certainly lost a lot of weight since he'd been taken in August of that year. He went on hunger strike last month, but his family requested that he stop that because his health deteriorated quite quickly.
He was held incommunicado for a long period of time. He was maltreated and subjected to at least psychological torture, and there are credible claims that he was also subjected to physical torture.
I
met with his family, and they tell me his health is really bad, and his mental state is appalling, as he feels repressed and subjugated, both inside and outside the prison.
According to the court that convicted him, Shai was guilty of having links with al-qaeda and taking photographs of Yemen security bases and foreign embassies to be targeted by the terrorist organization. The case was heard in one of two special courts created by the Saleh government. The courts have been pilloried by human rights groups as travesties within the Yemeni system of justice.
I can tell you that the proceedings of that court is a violation of basics of court trials. There are people who have been appointed by the intelligence or by the security apparatus in Yemen, and they lack credibility in the country. Their rulings, their sentences are a flagrant violation of human rights.
What that means in practical terms is that the defense lawyers are not supplied with all documents. The appeals process is curtailed and is not complete. Often, though not always, proceedings are held in a closed courtroom where observers are not allowed to be present.
The trial was unjust and biased, and I am not the only person who is saying this. He is sentenced to 5 years in prison. 5 years just to please the Americans. Salah wanted his voice to be muted inside prison, so the world didn't find out that Salah was using al-qaeda to blackmail the Americans.
In November 2010, WikiLeaks released a batch of U.S. diplomatic cables, one of which disclosed that President Saleh's government agreed to provide Washington with political cover by falsely claiming that U.S. airstrikes on al-Qaeda targets in Yemen were carried out by Yemeni forces. Those cables merely confirmed what Shai first reported almost 1 year earlier. He was the first reporter to travel to the site and publish pictures of fragments of cruise missiles and cluster bombs made in the USA that were not in the Yemeni arsenal. He reported that more women and children were killed in the airstrikes than militants. And that's not all he revealed.
His specialism was al-Qaeda. He had very good contacts within al-Qaeda through his family relations, really, through marriage in Abdul Shai's family. And he'd interviewed Anwar al-Awlaki, the last person to do so before al-Awlaki was killed last year in a drone strike. But most crucially, he covered some of the airstrikes in the south of the country here in Abiyan.
At the same time, he was the only journalist able or capable of gauging a sense of the scope, influence of al-Qaeda. This was constantly contradicted by the government, which was trying all the time to blow the al-Qaeda influence out of proportion to gain more leverage among the Americans.
2 months ago, after Shai had spent almost 1.5 years in jail, the Saleh government pardoned him and prepared to release him. But on February 2nd, President Saleh got a phone call from the Oval Office. According to the White House, President Obama expressed concern over the release. Shai remains in prison. Yemeni cartoonist Kamal Sharaf tells the story this way. Shai trapped behind bars colored red, white, and blue, with the U.S. ambassador to Yemen holding the keys.
I strongly believe that the American ambassador has the key to Abdullah's cell, so he must release him and guarantee that he will do his job as an ambassador for a country that shares diplomatic relations with Yemen. Supposedly, this relationship is based on mutual respect, but the American ambassador exercises powers bigger than the ones assigned to him, to an extent greater than the ones of the Yemeni president.
About a week after that cartoon was published, the U.S. ambassador was asked directly about the Shai case.
And the last question that I asked him was about Shia, and it was actually in relation to the concern that had been expressed to me by other Yemeni journalists here that the Americans keeping him in prison was making them afraid to do their job. He actually responded to me by initially laughing at my question as I expressed the concerns of other Yemeni journalists, before then saying that America had a direct interest in Shia's case.
19 months after being jailed, this Yemeni journalist remains imprisoned at the behest of the Obama administration. But neither the American nor Yemeni government will produce evidence of his alleged crimes. In a way, the silence of those governments speaks volumes, and other journalists in Yemen get the message.
The incarceration of Abdul Shai is definitely creating a climate of change among local journalists in Yemen. I've been talking to many of them about potentially trying to dig up for further stories in those pockets, particularly Shabwa, Abiyan and Zinjibar. And basically what they tell you is the following. If we do that, we will lose our job. We will be jailed by the government, or we will be jailed by the Americans.
Or they will be jailed by two governments, the one that puts them behind bars and the other one, a long way away, that keeps them there. We'll have more on the Shia case in a moment, but first, our Global Village voices on the coverage of the story in Yemen.
The Obama administration's decision to intervene and extend the detention of Yemeni journalist Shai shows how governments often interpret the freedom of the press only to mean the freedom to report within a certain narrow range of opinion. When governments do things like this, their real target is anyone else who might be inspired by their journalists to do similar things.
Abdul Shai's investigative journalistic work is invaluable. He reported actively and sufficiently to dismiss the idea of the terrorist attacks done by al-qaeda in Yemen. While he is in jail at the moment, local and international audience are missing one of the best truth tellers in Yemen.
We're always looking for new faces for the program. If you'd like to share your thoughts on the news media as one of our Global Village voices, just connect with us on Facebook or Twitter, where we will let you know what stories we're working on. Or you can get in touch with us via email. We're at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. And don't forget, our free video podcast, it's on iTunes. Just go looking for the Listening Post, Al Jazeera English, and you'll find us there. We're going to dig a little deeper now into the Yemen story with Jeremy Scahill. Scahill is an American investigative journalist. He is best known for his work on U.S. military contractors and his book, Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. Scahill traveled to Yemen recently and brought the Shia story back home to American audiences. Now, you would think that since 3 well-known U.S. media outlets all benefited from Shia's journalism, that those news organizations would be lobbying hard and publicly for his release. But you'd be wrong. Jeremy Scahill joins me now to talk about the case, why it matters, and the company President Obama is keeping when he works to keep Shia in jail. Jeremy Scahill, thanks for joining us today here at the Listening Post. Here's where I want to start. There are many journalists around the world currently in prison cells, not just in Yemen. But what was it about this particular case that compelled you to travel all the way to that country to bring this story home to Americans?
Well, first of all, I went to Yemen to investigate the broadening covert U.S. war in that country, not just in the form of drones, but also in support for the elite counterterrorism units inside of Yemen, as well as Tomahawk cruise missile strikes that have been authorized by President Obama since he took office. And I was very familiar with Abdul Shai's reporting. So when I got to Yemen, I wanted to investigate his case. There are many, many journalists in prison around the globe. There are not many that are in prison at the behest of the President of the United States.
Now, anonymous U.S. government sources had already told U.S. media outlets back in December 2009 that this was in fact a U.S. military action, despite the fact that at official levels it was described as a Yemeni airstrike on Yemen territory. So if that news was already out there in the U.S. mainstream media, why would Shai's work be of such concern to either the Yemeni or American governments?
Right, I'm glad you point that out. I mean, first of all, what was significant about what Abdul Shai did is not the revelation that it was a U.S. strike, but that it was not the great success that American officials were anonymously claiming and Yemeni officials were publicly claiming. In other words, there were not 34 members of al-Qaeda killed in that strike, but rather a tremendous number of women and children. So whether or not you think it was a scandal that it was a U.S. strike, the fact that so many civilians, women, children, the elderly were killed, I think was what put Abdul Shai on the American radar, if he wasn't already there, for his work in interviewing al-Qaeda figures.
And what seemed to come out of some of his reporting on al-Qaeda figures and on that movement itself, which was being described back in 2009 as the most dangerous al-Qaeda chapter still operating, was that it wasn't that big, it wasn't that dangerous. Do you think that was an important piece of characterization that then ended up putting him at risk?
I think it was a little more complicated than that. I think that what he was doing was covering al-Qaeda without starting from the perspective that these are terrorists that need to be hunted down and killed by U.S. drones or by Navy SEAL Team 6. In other words, he was interviewing these guys really wanting to know where were they coming from, what was their perspective, what was their agenda, what was their political philosophy. So I would say that it's more that he was covering it with some degree of nuance that is often missing from big media coverage of al-Qaeda. You know, a lot of people tend to say that, a lot of critics of Abdul Shai like to say that his journalism was supporting al-Qaeda. I don't think if you look at the body of his work, you could really make that argument. If you look at his interviews with Anwar al-Awlaki, who of course was a U.S. citizen that was ultimately killed in September of 2011 in a U.S. drone strike, his interviews were pretty critical with him. He pushed back against al-Awlaki for some inconsistencies in his statements. He asked him essentially, how could you praise Nidal Hassan, the U.S. Army major who was accused of killing more than a dozen of his fellow soldiers in Fort Hood, Texas? How can you praise that when those are his fellow Americans? So I think that that there's a lot of propaganda in attempting to paint him with a very wide brush of being pro-al-Qaeda, when I tend to think that it's more that he was not just assuming that those in power were telling the truth and was reporting this independently, and that in and of itself is offensive to a lot of people who just believe al-Qaeda should not be given the time of day to explain their agenda whatsoever.
Now, among the people who are lobbying for his release are some people who are associated with al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula. And I'm wondering, does that concern you at all, given some of the implied associations there?
Well, I mean, Abdul al-Haider can't choose who's going to call for his release from prison and who's not going to call for his release from prison. I would imagine, if I were in al-Qaeda's media wing, I would view his imprisonment as detrimental to their ability to have access to media. But their agenda and his don't have to be the same for them to call for his release. I mean, you could make that argument about me, for instance, when it comes to reporting on Somalia, that I actually have reported on the complexities of al-Shabaab, the militant Islamist resistance movement in Somalia. I mean, I don't see much of a difference between the handful of foreign reporters who travel to these places and actually try to report independently and seriously on these movements, and Abdul Shai, except for the fact that he's a Yemeni and he's not protected by holding an American or a British passport.
Well, we got in touch with the White House on this last week, and this is what we were told. The president's comments had absolutely nothing to do with Shai's reporting or his criticism of the United States or Yemen. A Yemeni court, not a U.S. court, convicted him. I'm guessing you might want to comment on that.
Of course I care to comment on it. I mean, first of all, let's break this down. What that statement says is that the White House is co-signing the verdict of a Yemeni court that has spurred massive outcry from the human rights and media freedom community the world over. On one side of this equation, in this case, you have Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the International Federation of Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and several foreign correspondents who've spent time reporting from Yemen. And on the other side of this, you have a specialized tribunal that's a kangaroo court system, the dictatorship of Ali Abdullah Saleh and President Barack Obama. So the White House should look at the company that it's keeping on this and rethink whether it believes that this court that was set up to prosecute journalists who criticize a dictatorship, that they want to actually go down in history as being on the side of that court. I think it's very clear that it was highly unusual for the White House to intervene in the case of an imprisoned journalist. And the fact is that the United States gives tremendous money to Yemen for counterterrorism purposes, supports the very institutions that are used to repress people throughout Yemen, and then has the audacity to turn around and say, well, we have nothing to do with this. They have everything to do with it. They could pull the plug on this immediately.
Now, what about the possibility of your government actually having something on Shai for security reasons or source protection reasons that it doesn't want to reveal? How possible is that in your mind? Is there even a sliver of possibility or plausibility to that?
Now, well, I mean, is there a sliver of possibility to it? Yes, because we live in an age of secrecy. The United States has asserted the right to kill U.S. citizens without trial or any semblance of due process, and yet it won't provide the legal justification for that, even to the relevant committees in the U.S. Congress that would be responsible for overseeing those kinds of operations and ensuring that they do, in fact, comply with the law. But what I think is a more relevant point to focus on here is that the U.S. Ambassador Gerald Firestein in Yemen essentially threatened Yemeni journalists by saying that if you don't do what Abdul al-Haider was doing, then you have nothing to fear from us, meaning the Americans. And what Abdul al-Haider did that we know of was interview al-Qaeda figures, travel to the scene of missile strikes that were conducted by the United States, and expose the civilian deaths and injuries that are caused by those strikes. If the United States has evidence against Abdul al-Haider Shia, then they should stop hiding behind a sham court in Yemen and produce that evidence. But we have a notion in the United States that unfortunately is becoming quaint when it comes to allegations of terrorism, and that's that you're innocent until proven guilty. And proven guilty doesn't mean proven guilty in a sham court set up by a dictatorship to defend itself against criticism from independent journalists. So I think it's shameful that the White House has come down on the side of a dictatorship's courts in this case and against an independent journalist who is known to work with major international media organizations and whose reporting has actually resulted in ammunition for those people that wanted Anwar al-Awlaki killed. Let's remember that Abdul al-Haider interviewed him after the massacre in Fort Hood, Texas, when Major Nidal Hassan opened fire on that army base. Abdul al-Haider was the first person to interview Anwar al-Awlaki, and because of him, we heard that al-Awlaki had praised those shootings. So, the White House alleging that somehow the verdict in Yemen was just against him and that he's affiliated with al-Qaeda, the idea that there's an affiliation beyond interviewing them as a journalist, to me has no basis whatsoever in fact, and I'd be very curious if the White House did have any information on that or confirmation that that's true, for them to produce it.
As you reported, Shai did work not just for Al Jazeera, but he also worked in one way or another, either as a freelancer or having his expenses paid by the Washington Post, the New York Times, and ABC News, all of them in the United States. Are you aware of any representations that any of these news organizations have made on his behalf?
Yeah. What I'm going to say right now about it is the extent of what I can say about any specific media organization. My understanding from sources within one of those media organizations that you cited, in a major American media organization, was that they were approached by the U.S. government earlier on, before Shai was actually locked up and put in prison and sentenced by this court, that a major U.S. media organization that had done work with him was approached and told that that they should stop working with him, suggesting that his relationship to al-Qaeda was more than just journalist-source relationship, and that organization stopped working with Abdul al-Haider. To my knowledge, none of those organizations have taken an editorial stance calling for his release or even condemning the sham nature of his trial. And I think that's really reprehensible. But it's part of a broader pattern here of the local journalists throughout the world who are on the front lines of gathering very dangerous news stories. They're abandoned by major news organizations when things go wrong. And I think that's a trend in journalism that just has to stop. Major news organizations, not just American, but around the world, have a responsibility to stand up for everyone at every level of their operation, whether they're a famous, celebrity correspondent in trouble in a war zone, or they're the person driving journalists around in cars, or they're the local journalist that you use to get your big scoop, and then when they get in trouble for getting that scoop, they go to jail and you continue to go on winning Pulitzers. That's a serious injustice against those media workers.
Okay, my last question to you is this. You've already told us what kind of work he did. You've told us who he was doing that work for. Now, try to give us an idea of what news audiences lose when a voice like this is silenced.
In every country that I've traveled to around the world to cover this, so-called war on terror, or the global contingency operation as it's called right now, whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq or Somalia or Yemen, one of the first things I always do is to get in touch with local journalists there who I know have access to parts of the story I will never have access to. When you lose people like Abdul Shai, or so many of the unknown Arab journalists that have been covering these conflicts for the past decade, when you lose their reporting, you lose access to a whole chunk of the story. And without that part of the story, people can't make informed decisions around the world on what policies that they want to support or oppose. You essentially are silencing a huge part of the truth. And so when you lock up journalists who are among the only people telling a side of the story that is so crucial to understanding the world in which we live, you're locking up the story itself. And you're attempting to ensure that history is only going to be written by the victors, and that the voice of those that live on the other side of the barrel of the gun, that those voices are going to be whited out of history. And to me, that's the biggest crime here. It's not just about one journalist in prison. It's about attacking journalists around the world, whether it's with guns or with prison cells or with sham courts. And so Abdul Shai could be a totally different journalist in a totally different country, but the principle is the same. When you lock up journalists that are braving it, to go out there and get a story that a lot of, let's be honest, white Western reporters wouldn't be able to get, then you're locking up the story. And that's the big injustice here. And that's why powerful governments are afraid of independent journalists. And unfortunately, the U.S. has put itself in league with some really repressive governments around the world in defending the imprisonment of an independent journalist.
Jeremy Scahill from The Nation magazine, thanks for talking to us today. Finally, our web video of the week, and a slightly different way to look at the Yemen story. Abdul Shai's reporting on the U.S. drone strikes is what got his work noticed and led to his imprisonment. The Onion is a satirical website based in the U.S., and the team there spends as much time mocking the media as it does politicians and celebrities. The Onion calls its political panel the first responders. And in this clip, the panel is trying to figure out if America's struggle to win hearts and minds in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the Muslim world has anything to do with drones, and whether those remote-controlled death machines in the sky could use a little rebranding. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Well, in efforts to reduce the number of troops in Afghanistan, the U.S. military has increasingly relied on the use of unmanned Predator drones. But after 10 years of combat in Afghanistan, is it time to take a second look at our policy of killing Afghan children with missiles shot from terrifying remote control flying robots? Well, for some answers on this, let's see what the first responders have to say. Hello, Duncan, Jason, Nancy. So, first responders, could dropping bombs on Afghans without warning from terrifying robot airplanes that fly themselves actually hurt America's efforts to stabilize Afghanistan?
It's complicated.
No, not at all. Actually, I think we need to stay the course. You don't change horses midstream, and you don't stop firing missiles from unseen death droids soaring high above the clouds just because a couple of schools get blown up.
I disagree with that. I mean, accidentally bombing children with our super army of automated missile-firing bots may have worked great at the start of the war, but conditions on the ground have changed. I mean, we have got to find another way to obliterate this population. Let's do what we can for these civilians. I mean, why not name the drones Billy or Steve to make them seem less dispassionate?
Oh, that is a terrible idea. Billy is a horrible name for a drone.
And Steve is even worse.
Keith?
Steve?
Well, you know what, some experts have suggested making robots that are more visually reassuring. This Pentagon report that was released saying that they're now developing a 40-foot robot that actually looks more like an American soldier and also sprays lasers out of his eyes.
Well, at least that's a step forward.
Hey, look, as long as it fires missiles and bombs with very little accuracy and 0 Americans are at threat, I'm all for it.
Good point.
They should give it funny, floppy arms.
Yes.
Oh, it should spray candy out of its chest a few minutes before it starts shooting everything.